What if I told you that the US government might be able to create over $5 trillion overnight out of thin air? Not by taxing, not by borrowing, but simply by changing one number in their accounting books. And this might sound crazy, but actually, over the last 8 months, we've seen evidence that this is a plan being discussed behind the scenes. If it were to happen, gold and Bitcoin probably would be repriced dramatically higher. This would really reshape the entire global financial system and probably impact every area of your life. So let me explain. Right now, the United States is facing a problem that no other country in history has ever solved peacefully. The US national debt is approaching $39 trillion, which works out to more than $356,000 for every US taxpayer. And every single year, the government is adding another $2 trillion in debt on top of it. In other words, we're borrowing over $2 trillion every year that we have to print to pay for just to keep the system running. And historically, when countries reach this point, they usually turn to one thing: printing money, exactly the thing we're doing. But there's a problem with that too, because every country in history that relied on paper money eventually ran into the same exact outcome. They had to return to gold or silver to restore trust. So the question becomes, could the US be preparing for something similar? For years, there's been a rumor floating around financial circles that someday the US government was going to revalue gold much, much higher. And I always thought that idea sounded kind of ridiculous, but over the last 8 months, some things have happened that makes that rumor a lot more serious. The first thing I noticed was a high-level economic advisor to Russian President Putin, Anton Kobikov, who said that the US was planning this massive change in the system. He said the US is planning to change the rules of gold and cryptocurrency. And so why would we do this? Because we have a massive debt that can't be repaid. So he's making fun of us in these comments. But what is interesting is he's basically saying that the US is going to use this system to devalue its debt. And that got my attention because this is a high-level figure saying the United States is doing this thing. And then a second thing popped up in my radar. In August 2025, an economist connected to the Federal Reserve Board published a research note titled Official Reserve Revaluations: The International Experience. And in that paper, they openly discussed the idea of revaluing government gold reserves. The United States holds the largest gold reserve in the world at about 261.5 million ounces. But here's the strange part. On the official government balance sheet, that gold is still valued at $42.22 per ounce. Yes, $42, even though gold trades around $5,000 per ounce in real markets. So the paper explored a question: what would happen if the government simply revalued that gold to market prices? So let's walk through the math. If the US revalued its gold to around $5,000 an ounce, the new accounting value would be about $1.3 trillion. Since the gold is currently booked at only about $11 billion, that creates roughly $1.29 trillion in new funds. Those funds can then be transferred to the Treasury, which means the government would suddenly have over $1 trillion of spending power without issuing new debt, without raising taxes, just by changing the accounting value of gold. And this isn't conspiracy theory, it's literally discussed in a Federal Reserve research paper, but it gets even bigger. Some analysts have speculated about much higher gold prices. You'll hear numbers like $15,000, $20,000, $30,000 per ounce. At $20,000 gold, the math changes dramatically. The US gold reserves would suddenly be worth about $5.2 trillion. That's enough to potentially reduce the national debt by $5 trillion overnight. Now think about what that means. The government would effectively be resetting the core of the entire financial system with one policy decision. And if they did that, I feel like they'd have to be a defender of the peg at that price. In other words, a buyer and seller of gold and dollars at that price that they now set in order to really reset the system and have it be approved or accepted by everybody. And so the internet says that's not true, but either way, it brings up another question. That question isn't really whether they can do this. The Federal Reserve's own research paper says they can. The question is, why would they? And what would it mean for you? Well, look at the situation. The US spends more money every year. Debt is growing faster than the economy, which means it's spiraling out of control. And countries around the world are slowly trying to reduce their reliance on the dollar. We're already seeing countries accumulating gold, trade happening outside the dollar, central banks buying record amounts of precious metals. So if inflation rises again, or if the global system starts to fracture, a large gold revaluation could give the US government a controlled way to restructure the system rather than simply reacting to a crisis. Now, politically speaking, if there was someone willing to attempt a massive financial reset like this, it might be someone like Donald Trump. Throughout his career, he's shown a willingness to do things very differently from traditional Washington policy. But the big question is, could he actually do it? Most likely, Congress would need to approve something like this, and with a divided government, that could be extremely difficult. Although, history does show that dramatic monetary moves have happened before. In 1971, Richard Nixon closed the gold window almost overnight without Congress. So big financial changes sometimes happen faster than people expect. Now, let me be clear. This doesn't mean the government will do this. It just means that they could do this. And things would probably have to get pretty bad for them to actually do it, but we've already talked about what's coming. If we think about what would happen in this scenario, is assets tied to scarce and real resources would probably soar dramatically. Things like gold and other precious metals, Bitcoin and other strong cryptocurrencies. There are many rumors that XRP could be involved here. Iraq's dinar could be revalued with its strong oil backing. Other commodity and commodity-tied assets would likely increase because when currencies are restructured, real assets tend to reprice against paper money. If you're interested in any of those topics, let me know in the comments so we know what people want to hear about. The real takeaway here is this. We have a global financial currency system that is undergoing a massive transition, a total currency reset. We need to understand that when these things happen, it's only about every 100 years, there are dark times in the transition for most. But it also means incredible opportunities for those of us who are aware of what's going on, and then we can be the ones that help, the light in the darkness. We need to look and see global debt levels are at all-time highs. Governments are experimenting on various solutions. Policymakers are talking openly in the public about things that would have seemed unheard of just a few years ago. So the smartest thing that we can do right now is to stay informed and be prepared. If you want more updates like this, breaking down what's happening in the global financial system, then make sure you're subscribed to the channel. And if you want to see how prepared your family is for the economic shifts ahead, make sure you check the description box. You can find there a link to access a free stewardship checklist. Because the goal here is not just to survive the years ahead, but to thrive and be positioned by the Lord to be a blessing to those around you when they need it most. Thanks.